None of us can ever forget that close encounter with a natural force. A bear. After all, they sneak up on you quietly and stealthily, as if they have mastered the art of stealth. When they are just a couple steps away from you, it will be one of the most frightening moments you've ever experienced. Forget the cute little creatures you used to cuddle with as a child. Face reality. They are a death machine weighing 70 stone, capable of destroying everything around them with devastating fury and lightning speed. To not miss interesting stories about animal attacks on humans, put a like and subscribe to our channel. Welcome to Wild Assault. In this video, you'll learn how a man named Ronn Hemstock survived being attacked by a bear during an early morning walk in Seward, Alaska. Ronn Hemstock had just started walking his dog and decided to call his brother to share the latest news. His daughter was getting married, and Ronn was filled with excitement. He enjoyed telling his brother this funny story about the upcoming event. And just as he began to tell it, everything suddenly changed. The dog that belonged to Hemstock appeared suddenly out of the darkness and dashed right between his legs. He noticed that its fur was fluffed up, its ears and tail drooped, and it had mail in its mouth. Hemstock sensed that something was wrong. At this time, he was on the phone and, tilting his head slightly, looked over his shoulder. A few meters away, about 20 to 25 paces, he saw a bear rushing toward him like a steamroller, with the expressive look of meat ready to attack. Hemstock realized he had no time to react except to turn and be grabbed. Hemstock had about resigned himself to the fact that he had been beaten for the last minute and a half, or so it seemed to feel. When at last he thought it was over and the bear had dragged him off the spot, the bear giving into his thought, he was relieved. It meant she would be back later, which gave him a chance to escape. But as soon as Hemstock opened his eyes, the bear once again dragged him back to where he had dropped his phone. So in that instant, he was able to reach for his phone, call his wife, 911, and summon help. And then fear gripped Hemstock. That fear was absent before. It was just there in that moment. But suddenly, just as people were on the USS Indianapolis during World War II, talking about the creepy sharks surrounding them waiting for their prey. That's exactly the feeling Hemstock had. He thought, she'll be back, and she did. At one time when he called 911, he heard her claws scrabbling on the ground as she walked around, sniffing. Then she disappeared. His dog came back and he felt much calmer. If she would sit next to him, then he was probably safe. Hemstock called 911 and was faced with an unpleasant situation. The guy who had caused his concern didn't want to stop making noise. He couldn't find any other option, so he decided to cover the phone with his chest, lie down on the ground, and cover his head. After a while, the tense moment was bypassed. The bear walked by and disappeared, and Hemstock didn't know which way she went. When the police arrived, Officer Woodard, a really decent guy, approached Hemstock and reported that it was too dark to see anything beyond his view. Walking over to the car, the officer simply drove up to Hemstock. Then, carrying a shotgun in his hand, the officer sat down next to the victim, and then they just stayed there waiting for the ambulance to arrive. It's hard to even imagine lying still like that after you've been attacked once and you hear the bear coming back. What would be on your mind if you were in such a situation? Would you be able to stay calm? Because that fight or flight reaction is really strong. Hemstock admitted that he had done wrong when he decided to run away. But that was due to his intense distress at the moment. He simply did not wish to repeat the dangerous experiment. He realized that it was his voice that had angered the bear as he shouted over the phone. The attack became much harsher as he continued to talk. But once the phone slipped out of his hands and he covered up, the chilled aggression seemed to subside. Hemstock says it's important to conduct yourself with caution and not be overly active. The advice is always to play dead, which he believes includes not only refraining from moving, but also not expressing your thoughts out loud. He is convinced that this only encourages the aggressor. Indeed, when he was silent and really quiet, in fact, she lunged at him, broke a few ribs and pulled him aside, after which it was over. But up until that point, he had been screaming on the phone and suffering unbearably as she scratched and punched him. He is convinced that this only encouraged the violence, so he recommends holding your tongue and trying your best to be discreet. Hemstock told a story about how he had recently learned some fighting moves and, in an unfortunate coincidence, blew out a rib in training. He went to his chiropractor, but even the specialist couldn't put it back in place. Thus, Hemstock was left to live with constant pain. However, when the bear suddenly jumped on his back for the first time, Hemstock experienced a strange sense of satisfaction. Perhaps it was due to his confidence in his abilities after his training. The next time, however, the bear did serious damage to Hemstock again, breaking several ribs, which was certainly far from pleasant. But to his surprise, Hemstock felt much better afterward. Perhaps it was because his body had adapted to the new conditions and had begun to repair itself. Hemstock happily stated that his life was getting better and was now much happier. He realized that when you seem to have nothing else, you begin to appreciate it even more when you get it again. When we go hunting, we often forget about the dangers that may await us. One of the most serious dangers is a bear attack. A bear is a huge animal with sharp teeth and strong paws, and its attack can be extremely dangerous and deadly. Bears are some of the strongest and most dangerous predators in the animal world. They can be unpredictable and aggressive, especially if they feel threatened or if they are disturbed in their territory. Our next story is no exception. In this video series, you will learn about one man's incredible survival after a grizzly attack. According to an article in the Washington Post, Joey Lawrence was on a hunting trip in Yellowstone National Park when he was unexpectedly confronted by a huge grizzly. Instead of feeling fear, he remembered his family and friends, and that stimulus helped him keep his cool. Our story begins with Kenneth Wells spending a Saturday night by the fire in the Shoshone Forest, feeling frustrated. His hunting trip had been a failure, and for 3 days in a row, he had returned to camp empty-handed. He recalled how on Wednesday, he had sadly admitted that he had seen nothing, but had certainly longed to see something. But what he had seen, and that, what had happened to him, would forever be etched in his memory. One must be careful what one wishes for, however. The 54-year-old Wells is now recovering from serious wounds sustained from a grizzly bear that attacked him the day after spending the evening at the campfire. Kenneth Wells was still in a state of shock, as he noted in his phone interview. He couldn't believe that a real miracle had occurred, that he had survived the bear attack. I'm sure it takes some time before he can recover, and the rest of his life will be scarred. However, all in all, it's pretty much over now. This fact occurred when Kenneth and his younger brother Mark went archery hunting on Sunday in an area southeast of Yellowstone National Park. Suddenly, they heard a low barking sound. A moment later, the noise repeated, drawing the brothers' attention. Mark suddenly rose from his seat, feeling a kind of uneasiness that irresistibly pulled his eyes toward the area where Kenneth and his bow were. He looked around and saw a female grizzly along with 2 small cubs. It was becoming increasingly clear to Mark that he was in the presence of a real bear. He sharply shouted the words and hesitantly stepped back in an effort to maintain a safe distance. However, despite Mark's warning and retreat, Kenneth could not resist the opportunity to get a glimpse of this mighty beast. He got up and moved closer, despite the proximity of danger. Kenneth felt a terrific mixture of interest and anxiety, but even in his wildest fantasies, he had never imagined that the bear would be so close. He tried to realize what had happened as the sounds and smells of the forest filled his mind. Only after a few moments that seemed like an eternity, the bear suddenly lunged at Kenneth and bit into his ribs with force. He felt the sharp teeth piercing his flesh, felt the bear's blows aimed at his defense. Kenneth still felt the shock, unable to believe what was happening. It was a moment he would never forget. An encounter with a bear that became personal and dangerous. Kenneth was crushed by the bear and felt overwhelming pain as his eyes merged with the dark, piercing eyes of the predator. He couldn't remember what the bear's growl sounded like or what he himself yelled back. At that moment, he simply had no time for fear. He didn't have time to experience fear, perhaps not until 10 minutes after it was over, when Kenneth had regained consciousness and he and his brother were packing their gear, grabbing their backpacks, and heading back toward our camp. It was then that the adrenaline level began to drop, and Kenneth felt the fear and pain he was experiencing for the first time. The attack occurred on the same day that a Rutgers University student was killed by a black bear in New Jersey. Kenneth involuntarily recalled this tragic story in which the forces of nature and human vulnerability were reconciled. Experienced Southwest Airlines pilot Kenneth Wells recalls the dangerous event that almost became his last. At a time when it's common to start talking about minor incidents before a crash, he happily survived only because of little things that worked in his favor. Wells confessed that his life was saved thanks to the bear spray that his brother Mark, who happened to be hunting with him, had with him. Thanks to his brother's eye doctor, they were able to deal with the terrifying attack of the beast. Kenneth notes that his knowledge of his surroundings and the hunting experience he gained with his brother was instrumental in their survival. As a former Boy Scout, he spent many years studying nature and reading magazines full of helpful tips. He hoped that this knowledge would help him cope with the incredible situation they found themselves in. To this day, when Kenneth closes his eyes, he still gets a grizzly in his imagination again. The bear and the fear that encompassed him over and over again. But he wonders how long it will be before those memories become less vivid and disappear forever. For Kenneth Wells, the event was a real challenge. But through experience and unexpected little things, he was able to overcome the worst moments and stay alive. According to Kenneth Wells, everything happened so fast that he could not believe his eyes. Mark sprayed the animal with bear spray, and he and his brothers gathered their belongings and left the scene. They traveled over a mile on foot to the campground, then about 3.12 miles to the start of the trail. Then it took them about 45 minutes by automobile to get to the nearby town of Dubois. However, when they arrived, the town clinic was closed, so Wells called emergency services. After 7 hours of waiting, an ambulance eventually arrived to take him to the emergency room located in Lander. According to Wells, he was given antibiotics, a tetanus shot, and 2 rabies shots in the ward. His wounds were washed, but the largest stab wound was left open, because doctors feared a secondary infection if stitched. X-rays showed no internal injuries, but he was left in the hospital for observation. One of his major disappointments was that he was unable to return to the woods to camp with his brother. Wells said the event will not affect his desire to visit the forest. He plans to go back there again, although maybe not right away. He plans to return next year. Since the attack happened near where a bear killed a U.S. Forest Service man. A week ago, Wells learned about that incident from a Reuters report. Wells said he didn't start crying until he called his wife hours after the attack, while already in the emergency room. It's just one of those events that you don't even think about that could happen to you. Now Kenneth Wells has time to think about how he's going to use this second chance at life. In the following story, you will learn about a group of collegiate wrestlers who encountered a grizzly attack. The incident occurred when the athletes were hiking in the mountains of Montana. While practicing in the woods, they spotted 5 grizzlies moving in their direction. The athletes used their knowledge and experience to keep themselves safe from attack. They turned around to face the beasts and began making loud noises to intimidate the grizzlies. A true friend will always try to keep his buddy out of trouble. That's why when Brady Lowry came across a fresh surprise in the backwoods of Wyoming near Yellowstone in October, he immediately warned his friend Kendall Cummings. Those were probably the last words he had time to say. Brady and Kendall had only been co-teammates on the Northwestern College wrestling team for about a month and a half, but had become fast friends. Brady, a freshman, was already able to compete in the JUCO All-American tournament. After a year off, he went back to college and the team. Kendall, a sophomore, has been working hard to get into the lineup. Practicing wrestling together is something special that can become a lasting bond of friendship in just 6 weeks. The endless 5-mile runs, the sweat, the blood, and the hard work seen everywhere in such workouts all created a special mutual bond between the two athletes. There was violence and forgiveness, hours and hours of tireless work on themselves. It all changed them, brought them closer together, and created a lasting bond. And that's exactly what happened with Brady and Kendall. So they started spending time together after workouts. They both loved being outdoors. When wrestling season started in early October, Brady told Kendall about his earnings from shed hunting. This hunt involves carefully skirting mountain trails around Yellowstone National Park to look for antlers that elk, masal deer, and other males drop once a year. A big antler pickup can cost about $200. A successful day of shed hunting can bring a college student up to $500. And today, Oct 15, things seem to be shaping up perfectly. They met regularly with Gus Harrison and Orrin Jackson, two other wrestlers from Northwestern College. On the day they hiked the Bobcat Houlihan Trail, the two friends were teased about Gus's bright red sweatshirt, which he wore instead of camouflage or dark clothing. Not to be outdone, they constantly joked about it, saying he would become a flashing food symbol for the aggressive wildlife in the area. For most of the day, all four of them stuck together. They hiked about 15 miles in 6 hours, their path traveling along the outskirts of Yellowstone. Moving from one section of wide, jagged rocks to another, they found places where every bush and tree seemed to cluster together, creating areas that made the area look dense and dense for miles around. As dusk approached, they decided to split into pairs and agreed to meet in an hour at a certain rock in the distance. Brady and Kendall headed up the mountainside, leaving Gus and Orrin below. By 4 p.m., the couples were a half-mile apart, so that Brady and Kendall could barely hear Gus and Orrin's conversations and jokes below. As Brady and Kendall climbed to the top of the mountain, they found themselves in thick brush that practically obscured visibility of the ground. Kendall was about 50 feet away from them when he suddenly heard Brady yell, "Look out! There's a huge pile of bear shit!" Just at that instant, they heard a loud cracking sound. Brady, barely having time to finish his sentence, shrieked, "Bear!" before a 500-pound grizzly kicked him in the chest. The two wrestlers now found themselves in the toughest match of their lives. There is an ancient proverb similar to, "If you choose to be a bear, be a grizzly." The origins of this phrase are unknown and difficult to pinpoint, with dating back over 100 years. Some have incredibly attributed it to Mahatma Gandhi. The real essence of this quote is people's admiration for the exceptional ferocity of the grizzly, perhaps the most dangerous living creature on the planet. It is difficult to compare the grizzly to a tiger or hippo, but wildlife experts say that the grizzly ranks first among these dangerous animals. Grizzlies live in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which covers areas of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. Grizzlies are federally protected, and killing them, even in self-defense, presents a serious legal challenge. If an investigation casts doubt on the legality of self-defense, shooting a grizzly can result in a year in jail and a $50,000 fine. Grizzly attacks on humans are rare. Yellowstone literature sources say the odds of a grizzly hurting a human are about 1 in $2.7 million. Yellowstone's official website states that 8 people have died from grizzly attacks in 150 years, one more than from falling trees. However, if a grizzly feels threatened by its habitat, food supply, or worse, its cubs, remain cautious. The average female grizzly weighs about 500 pounds. They reach heights of 7 feet, are capable of speeds of about 30 miles per hour, and their jaws will easily crush a bowling ball. So Brady didn't stand a chance. He was a 2-time Utah high school state champion and was ranked 7th in the nation in his weight class as a freshman. That meant he had trained his whole life and was used to leading strong men. However, on this day, he faced something he had never faced before. A bear, probably a mother grizzly, hit him hard and threw him 30 yards off the uneven ground. She ran past his tumbling body, hitting him as he tried to roll over. He still remembers how his body stopped and the bear continued to scramble him with its paws, nearly knocking him to the ground. Kendall was about 30 yards away, with his back to the bear, when the first attack began. He watched as this unfathomable cruelty to his friend took place and couldn't believe how fast and brutal it was happening. He wanted to help, but how? If he came any closer, he might be thrown off like a corn pillow, and then they would both likely die. Perhaps the best chance was to run away and summon help from Gus and Orrin, then try to flank the bear. Kendall remembered that Gus had a rifle and knew that Gus was an excellent shot. Perhaps running was their only chance. However, when he saw the bear raping and dragging Brady, he realized that his friend had about 30 seconds to live. Watching this, He was reminded of all the times they had fought Brady, lost in scuffles, and started over again. You know those families where everyone fights and fights, but no one dares even go near them? That's how Kendall felt when he was attacked by the bear. And then Kendall started yelling at the bear. There was no response. He picked up a stick, threw it, and hit the bear. Nothing happened. He threw a rock, a perfect hit to the bear's back. Still, not interesting. The bear was vicious, and nothing could distract him from killing. And so he made his most dangerous attempt at an attack. Kendall approached and threw himself on the bear's back, nibbling the fur on her neck. That got the grizzly's attention, and she turned at the very moment Kendall released her and ran away. Kendall hoped that maybe his counterattack would throw the bear off guard and distract it long enough for Brady to get off the ground and run in another direction. Maybe, just maybe, the bear will be satisfied if they can just run away. But there's a reason most bear experts say the only way to survive a grizzly attack is to play dead. As Kendall ran away, he was undisturbed and looked back to see what the bear would do. Terrified, he watched as it bounced off Brady's body, took several huge leaps, and was now on top of him. The threat of violence, which inexplicably contributed to survival, frightened everyone. In the thick of things, Kendall was mercilessly felled to the ground and attacked by a ferocious creature. Stinking breath, filled with the odor of rancidity and bloodlust, emanated from the mouth of the attacking monster. His attempt to defend himself by shoving his hand into her mouth turned into useless agony as her teeth persistently bit his face and head. Finally, however, her jaws closed over his face, biting him several times until Kendall passed out on the ground. The bear stared at Kendall's motionless body for a moment and then slowly disappeared into the woods, searching for Brady. When Kendall regained consciousness and struggled to open his eyes, he tried to see if his friend was gone. His face was smeared with blood so badly that he couldn't make it out. He just knew that the bear was moving away and he might have a chance to escape. Finally, with the bear out of sight, Kendall tried to get up and find his way down the mountain. His wound was bleeding and his bicep was dangling off the bone, but he was alert and determined. He hoped to find his 3 friends so they could leave this place together. He didn't even know if Brady had survived the initial attack. Without a second thought, Kendall let out a loud scream. It was at that moment that he heard a rumble that didn't belong to his friend. The bear was coming back. With Kendall on his feet, Brady jumped to his feet as the bear turned her attention to him. Brady yelled Kendall's name, but the bear was already picking up speed, catching up to him. Seeing that Kendall was able to run faster than he thought he could, Brady decided that his friend needed to get out of this dangerous situation on his own. Stopping for a moment, Brady pulled out his cell phone to call for help and then ran out into the clearing to warn Gus and Ronn. He hoped that Gus would be able to go up the mountain and shoot the bear, saving them all. At the same time, he received the signal. He dialed the emergency number. To the operator, he told the operator what had happened and his exact location, and then spotted Gus and Ronn 200 yards below. And the only reason he could tell them apart at that distance was Gus's bright red sweatshirt. As he held the phone to his ear, Brady yelled, "Help!" and waved his hand. The wrestlers at the bottom of the hill couldn't understand his words. Gus waved back in a smile, thinking Brady was just joking. However, as Brady, barely keeping his balance, made his way down the trail, Gus and Ronn noticed that he was holding his left arm still, as if broken, pressed against his side. It was obvious he wasn't shouting a greeting. He needed help. They rushed toward him, with Gus in front. He heard the words, "bear" and "Kendall," and at that moment, Gus really sped up. Climbing up the mountain, he drew his gun and prepared for a confrontation with the bear. Ronn walked over to Brady and took the phone from him. The emergency operator told them not to go back into the woods, that help was on the way, and advised them to get off the trail and head for their vehicles. They couldn't stop the grizzly attack on their own, so they had to proceed as instructed. Gus grabbed Brady and started running up the hill, following the man in the red hoodie. But Brady was in terrible physical and emotional shape. His forearm was broken in half from a bear bite, and the bone was sticking out of his arm like it had been ripped from his own body. And worse, he didn't think he could bear the sight of the horror that awaited them at the top of the hill. Kendall wasn't dead, but he was barely breathing. As Gus approached the scene with gun in hand, the bear returned to Kendall and attacked him again. It then leaned over and bit him in the head, tearing his body off the ground. Kendall felt the teeth penetrate his skull with a thud, and he lost consciousness. He had puncture wounds on his leg and shoulders and realized he could not continue the battle. A deadly silence enveloped them as the bear simply stood beside him. Kendall lay with his eyes closed, feeling calm, thinking that this moment might be his last. But suddenly he felt the bear woman poke his side with her paw. She elbowed him again and again. Kendall realized that his backpack, filled with the antlers they had found earlier, was so bulky that the bear couldn't knock it over. It may have saved his life. After several unsuccessful attempts to flip him over, the bear began throwing dirt on his body. He remained motionless, and the bear probably thought he was dead. Kendall guessed that she then covered his body with mud so she could move on to her cubs and then come back to eat him. He heard the distant sound of a helicopter coming closer and closer to him. Kendall's heart hammered harder with the hope that it was a rescue. He was thankful that he had experienced and dedicated friends who realized something was wrong and came to his aid. Soon the helicopter landed near Kendall, and he saw his friends and rescuers ready to lend a hand. They were armed and ready to give him all the medical attention he needed. These were true heroes who were determined not to leave their friend alone in a dangerous situation. Soon Kendall was in a safe area where he received emergency medical care. His friends took care of him, supporting him and assuring him that Brady would be safe. Shortly after the events in the woods, Kendall learned that Brady had been found and was also rescued. It was an unexpected turn of events, and it seems that their friendship only grew stronger after their ordeal. During this time, Kendall realized how important it is to have trustworthy friends who are willing to come to the rescue in times of need. He realized that without his friends, he would not have been able to cope with all the difficulties he faced. After a few weeks, Kendall recovered and rejoined his team. He knew that the safety and support of his friends would always be there for him, and they would be able to overcome any challenges together. Their friendship and unity became their impenetrable defense that helped them survive the most unforeseen circumstances. When EMTs evaluated both men, they called an ambulance helicopter for Kendall, but took Brady to the nearest hospital in Powell, just a few miles from Northwest's campus. He said goodbye to his friend and thanked him again for saving his life. He promised he would visit Kendall as soon as he could. The helicopter would take Kendall to a trauma center in Billings, Montana. His injuries weren't exactly life-threatening, but he needed urgent head and facial repairs that only a major hospital could provide. They couldn't believe what had happened, of course, but they also couldn't believe they were still alive. "I knew enough about Grizzly attacks to know that we probably shouldn't have survived," Brady says. At Powell Hospital, Brady was in his room when doctors came in and told him how damaged his arm really was. His forearm was broken so badly that they needed an orthopedic surgeon to examine it that night and probably required immediate surgery. They told him that they had arranged for him to be transported to a place that made him burst into tears again in a moment. Kendall couldn't believe his eyes when he saw Brady and Orrin approaching them. They were alive and unharmed. It was an incredible feeling of relief and joy. It looked like they had managed to find their own way out of a dangerous situation. They continued on their way along the trail, protecting each other and looking around carefully for a new threat. But this time, the bear did not appear, and they reached the place where the ambulance was to pick them up. Brady, unable to contain his emotions, hugged Kendall tightly and with tears of happiness. Both of them were covered in blood and had experienced terrible agony, but that hug was a symbol of their strong friendship and survival. They knew this experience would change them forever. They faced death face to face and survived. This experience brought them closer together and strengthened their trust in each other. They realized how important it is to have people to rely on in their most difficult moments. Over time, their wounds healed, and long conversations and support for each other helped them deal with their injuries, both physical and emotional. They decided that they would never forget that day and would always treasure their lives and the friendship that had saved them from death. Now, they had a new outlook on life and a new understanding of how fragile and precious every minute is. They decided not to put their dreams on hold and pursue happiness and success, because they had already learned how vulnerable and fleeting moments in life can be. When the ambulance arrived and picked them up, they looked away, feeling grateful to fate and happy that their lives had gotten a fresh start. They realized that this experience had made them stronger and ready for new challenges that fate might throw at them. Together they could overcome any danger, for their friendship was an irresistible force. An ambulance flashed through the city streets at speed, carrying Brady and Kendall to the hospital in Billings, Montana. The boys were dried up and exhausted, but the friend beside them was considerably more important. Their friendship had survived a series of trials, and now they were together again, neighbors in a hospital room. Brady couldn't believe that Kendall had been able to save his life during the bear attack. Now, lying in the same room, both of their thirst and hunger came together. They shared small pieces of ice and discussed how they longed to drink and enjoy a full meal. Despite their wounds and pain, they kept the conversation light and joked with each other. Brady couldn't take his eyes off his friend, full of admiration and gratitude. Kendall had risked his life to save Brady, and now Kendall himself needed help and support. At this time, Brady's father, Dallas, arrived at the hospital. He was amazed at Kendall's courage and bravery, truly admiring the young boy who had become a hero to his son. Together, they reflected on how strong friendships can be and how important it is to have someone to lean on in critical moments. Finally, the nurses allowed Kendall to drink a little. He said he was dreaming of his favorite drink, a Baja Blast from Taco Bell. Dallas Mowry immediately went to get the drink, despite the limited conditions and long distance. As soon as he returned with a giant bowl of Baja Blast, Kendall smiled happily, thanking his friend's dad. Kendall slowly prepared himself for the surgery that was inevitable. His face was disfigured from the bear attack, and shards of teeth were found in his mouth. But the surgeons professionally reconstructed his face and secured his head with staples. After a few days, strangely enough, both Brady and Kendall traveled back home, their state of mind and body restored. The experience had left a deep mark on their lives. They realized that neither injury nor pain could destroy their friendship. They became even closer and developed a deep respect and gratitude for each other. Restored and stronger, they reunited with the team at Northwestern and continued their journey forward, knowing that their friendship was even stronger after this ordeal. They were going to live. But would they ever be the same again?